Decades had passed, but the memory of the cave still clung to him like a scar that no time could scrub clean. It was the smell he remembered most: charred stone, rainwater hissing against still glowing embers, and the faint copper temps of blood pooling between fractured scales. The dragon had been barely more than a shadow then, collapsed into the rubble, eyes dulled to the color of old smoke. He'd been younger, reckless, his ship burning behind him, yet for reasons he never fully admitted, he'd dragged her broken body out of the fire and fed her what little rations he had left. The galaxy had called her species extinct. Key had simply refused to let her die. Now the station's corridors whispered with the same echo that cave once held hollow. Q, wary, too quiet for safety. The recycled air tasted metallic, thick with ozone from overworked shielding. His boots struck the deck in a rhythm that made every shadow ahead seem poised to move. Somewhere beyond the reinforced observation glass, stars burned cold and uncaring, but closer. Closer, there was something else, something that had followed him. The Cums had gone dead 2 hours ago. Before that, the last thing he'd heard was the outpost's commander choking mid-sentence, a wet rasp cut short by the sound of tearing metal. He told himself it was pirates, raiders, anything human. But deep in the marrow, he knew the truth. This was not a human thing. It had weight. It had breath. It had been patient for decades. A faint vibration shivered through the soles of his boots. Not the hum of the station's gravity stabilizers, too irregular, too alive. His mind flicked, unbidden, to that moment in the cave when her breath had first returned in a slow, rattling sigh. When one molten gold eye had cracked open to meet his. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not like a latte, not like threat, but as though she were memorizing the shape of his face for later. Somewhere down the next corridor, a low sound rolled out of the dark. Not a roar, not a growl. Something softer, heavier, wrapped in memory and hunger. It carried the heat of a world long burned away and the quiet promise of a debt coming due. He did not run. He simply tightened his grip on the pulse rifle, though. A part of him knew it would be useless if she wanted it to be. The shadows shifted. The air grew hotter. And for the first time since that night in the cave, he thought he saw her. Heat rolled in waves along the corridor, thick enough to taste. The emergency lights flickered once, casting jagged red across the deck, then steadied, their pulse sinking to the hammering of his heart. The kind of mass you didn't get from human footsteps or cargo drones. This was a living weight, bending the air before it even arrived. He advanced slowly, pulse rifle up, each step deliberate to keep from betraying urgency. Panic made people clumsy. Clumsy got people killed. The deck beneath him vibrated in irregular bursts, as if whatever approached was pacing in and out of his range, circling, testing. The dragon had done that once, in the cave, too broken to stand, but still calculating every weakness in him before deciding whether to trust his hands. He rounded the corner into a stretch of corridor lined with viewing ports. Beyond the glass, the station orbited the dying remnants of a gas giantess, clouds torn into ribbons by tidal storms, lightning boiling under orange and violet layers. The reflection on the glass shifted, but he hadn't moved. The shape behind him was massive, tapering at the edges into a suggestion of wings. Though no sound of movement followed, a breath rolled across his neck, hot enough to tighten his skin, damp enough to remind him that whatever it was had lungs, not vents. The rifle twitched in his grip, but his finger stayed off the trigger. In the reflection, two eyes burned low and steady gold with a fracture of molten red through the center, exactly as they had been in the cave. His pulse jumped to the memory of those eyes blinking open against the smoke and ruin. She had been helpless then, ribs shattered, scales split to raw tissue. He'd patched her with metfoam, meant for human combat injuries, spent 3 days in darkness feeding her water drop by drop. When she could finally lift her head, she'd said nothing, just stared at him, as though memorizing him all over again. Now, the gaze in the glass was neither wounded nor tentative. It was the steady, measured look of something that had survived because of him, grown stronger far beyond his imagining, and carried an unspoken understanding of what that meant. She moved, and the reflection wavered, not a leap or an attack, but a slow, deliberate step forward that made the light bend around her form. The glass fogged in a sudden exhale. Words rose in his mind, unbidden, not spoken, not sound, but thought pressed directly against thought. You remember that the rifle sagged by a fraction. The air between them felt weighted, stretched thin like the skin of a drum. Beyond the glass, the gas giant's lightning flared, and for a heartbeat, her full shape filled the reflection's leak, scaled, immense, and very much alive. Somewhere deeper in the station, metal screamed as if something enormous had torn it open. The sound came closer. This time, she turned her head toward it. Not him. The scream of tearing bulkheads carried through the station like a metal heartbeat, each shriek rattling through the reinforced ribs of the corridor. Heat still rolled from her presence, but it was no longer pressing toward him was aimed outward, radiating in slow surges, like a storm gathering strength. She stood in shadow, not hiding, but letting the threat in the deeper corridors come. Closer, he'd seen predators do that before. They didn't run. They waited until the danger made the mistake of thinking it was the hunter. The smell changed ozone, sharpened, layered with a sour, acrid sting of coolant and something else. Something organic that had no place in recycled station air. The vibrations through the deck were heavier now, rhythmic, deliberate. His grip on the rifle tightened. They didn't have weight you could feel before you saw them. This was something worse. She shifted her stance, claws tapping faintly against the deck plating. The sound soft, yet full of promise. Lightning from the dying gas giant flared through the viewing ports again. Wings, half folded against a body built for flight and killing in equal measure. The decades had remade her. What had once been torn and skeletal was now whole. Corded with muscle and edged in weapons nature had carved and time had perfected. Memory tried to pull him back to that cave, the heat of her breath when it had been weak. The stubborn will that had kept her alive when every system in her body had been failing. She had watched him then with that strange, unreadable stillness, drinking in every movement of his hands as he worked to keep her alive. That same stillness was here now, but it wasn't weakness anymore. It was intent. The corridor ahead groaned, walls buckling inward as something immense forced its way through. The emergency light stuttered in fear, shadows flinching across the floor. He caught glimpses, slate-colored plating, too many limbs, jaws that unfolded sideways around wet, hooked teeth. The thing's bulk filled the space, scraping against the ceiling, leaving trails of torn steel. She stepped forward. The temperature spiked, the air thickening until every breath burned. Her wings shifted, not fully spreading, but loosening like a blade sliding from a sheath. A low sound built in her chest deep, resonant and layered with something that vibrated the air itself. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. Mine. He didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was at her flank. Pulse rifle aimed past her toward the corridor breach. His mind whispered that this was insane, that he'd come here to investigate a distress signal, not fight alongside a legend he'd once carried, half dead, through fire. But his body already knew where he belonged. The creature on the other side of the buckled wall finally pushed through, the bulkhead snapping like bone. It saw them, hesitated for the smallest heartbeat, and then lunged. She moved first. The lunge was pure mass and momentum. The thing's limbs hammering the deck hard enough to make the viewing ports shiver in their frames. jaws open wide, unfolding like a mechanical trap built in bone and cartilage, saliva hissing as it hit. The overheated air, she met it halfway. No hesitation, no calculation, just motion born of a predator who knew she was the stronger one. Her wings snapped outward with a sound like sails catching a hurricane. The corridor's narrow walls weren't meant to contain such force, slammed against him, shoving him back a step as she collided with the creature mid-charge. Claws raked deep, sparks and wetness spraying together as she tore through plating and flesh in the same stroke. The heat from her body flared in a pulse, searing enough to make the exposed wiring in the walls shrivel and die. The thing didn't fold. It screamed high and warbling, the pitch tearing at the edges of human hearing. Its limbs lashed in wild arcs, smashing panels and sending shards of composite skittering across the deck. One hooked claw caught her side, opening a line of blackened scales and oozing blood, thick as molten tar. She didn't slow. If anything, the injury drove her harder. He braced against the wall and fired, pulse rifle bucking in his hands. Bolts of blue-white energy punched into the creature's torso, sizzling through gaps in its armor. It staggered once, but its attention never left her. She slammed it into the far wall with enough force to buckle the bulkhead, then bit down where its neck plates met, molten light spilling from the wound as her jaws locked. The heat was suffocating now, sweat streaming down his back, under the armor. The station's ventilation systems howled in protest, emergency klaxons joining the chaos. Panels overhead split, dropping cabling like tangled vines. The creature thrashed one last time, then went limp, the metal deck ringing under the weight of its collapse. She released it with a slow, deliberate motion, the kill controlled, not frantic. Blood steamed off her muzzle, and for a moment her breathing matched his fast, heavy, alive. The wound along her side glistened in the strobing light, but she stood tall. Wings folding back with slow precision, his heart pounded hard enough to drown out the alarms. He lowered the rifle, realizing he'd kept pace with her, moving when she moved, firing where her attacks left openings. It had felt natural. Her head turned toward him, gold-red eyes locking on his. Not a look of gratitude, not threat. Something heavier. A recognition. Behind it, something else stirred in the dark of her gaze, like a promise that had been waiting decades to be called in from deeper in the station. Another metallic shriek rose, louder, closer. There was more than one. She moved toward the sound, without a backward glance. The sound spread like a ripple through the station's spine metal, groaning. Bulkheads flexing under pressure they were never designed to withstand. It wasn't just another creature. It was many. The vibrations in the deck multiplied, overlapping in uneven beats until the floor felt like it was alive beneath his boots. Somewhere overhead, a conduit ruptured, showering sparks and a chemical stench that clung to the back of his throat. She stalked forward, head low, wings partially unfurled, in a way that made the corridor feel smaller than it was. Every motion was measured, the kind of stillness that builds inside a predator before it explodes. He stayed close on her flank, rifle ready, eyes darting to every intersection, every vent, every shadow. The creatures were coming through the station's maintenance arteries, those narrow crawl spaces that threaded between life support ducts and power conduits. Places no human could navigate quickly, but where something with claws and an appetite could move like water. The first of the swarm dropped from the ceiling 10 meters ahead. Its body was slick and angular, like something grown from bone and metal fused together, too many limbs skittering in sync. It didn't even hesitate before lunging. She caught it midair, twisting with a violent snap that broke its body in two. The pieces smoked as they hit the deck, leaking fluid that sizzled on contact with her heat. But the kill wasn't clean enough to stop the others. Shapes poured from vents, from behind warped panels, from fissures in the floor where the earlier fight had cracked the plating. They came in dozens, each moving with that unnatural coordination that spoke of something hive-bound. He fired into the advancing line, bolts flaring bright in the dark. His shots burned through some instantly, but others kept coming even with half their limbs gone. She moved through them like a storm, claws shredding, wings battering them into walls. Her tail whipping hard enough to send bodies smashing into bulkheads. Heat radiated from her in pulses now, making the air shimmer and turning the deck slick with evaporating fluids. One creature managed to bypass her. Skittering along the wall toward him, he pivoted, firing point-blank into its head. Bone and armor, the corpse hitting the floor, still twitching. He stepped back instinctively, only to feel the deck flex under something heavy moving beneath it. The plating erupted, throwing him sideways. She was there before the thing could close. On him, jaws locking around its middle and tearing it in half in a shower of blackened gore. The motion was seamless, like defending him was just part of the fight. No thought, no pause, just the same instinct that had once made him drag her broken body out of that burning cave. The swarm faltered after the loss of several dozen bodies, retreating into the same gaps they'd come from. The station groaned under the damage, lights flickering hard enough to plunge them into near darkness between stutters. Somewhere ahead, deeper toward the command deck, came the sound of something larger than all of these. Something that didn't skitter, something that walked. She turned toward the sound, wings shifting. This time, she looked back at him. The air was thicker now, the metallic tang giving way to something sour and damp, like soil that had never seen the sun. Every breath carried weight, clinging to his lungs as though it didn't want to leave. The deck beneath them trembled in slow, deliberate intervals, no frantic scuttling this time, no chaotic scatter. Whatever was ahead didn't need to hurry. It knew exactly where they were and how this would end. She moved with less urgency now, though her muscles coiled beneath the scales, ready to ignite at a moment's notice. Each step made the deck hum faintly, the sound mixing with the groans of stressed metal around them. He followed, rifle up, eyes darting, heart trying to match the slow rhythm of the vibrations through the floor. It was like walking toward the heartbeat of something colossal. The corridor opened into a maintenance hub. The space wide enough for a landing shuttle, walls lined with broken equipment and leaking conduits. Pools of coolant glistened under the emergency lights, the thin mist rising from them, catching in the heat she carried. He could see the reflection of her eyes in the slick floor-molten gold, with that fracture of red still burning through the center. The first sign of the thing ahead wasn't visual. It was pressure, a shift in the air that pressed against his chest, subtle but undeniable. Then came the sound, low grinding resonance that vibrated through his teeth. Shapes moved in the far shadows, large shapes, their edges glinting faintly with wetness and steel. When it stepped forward, the scale of it tore away whatever fragments of courage he thought he'd built. It was easily 3 times her size, its body plated in a dark, iridescent armor that seemed to drink in the emergency light. Its head was a brutal wedge of bone and chitin, the jaws split into 4 segments that curled inward when closed. From its back hung limp, segmented tendrils twitching as though catching scents in the air. The swarm hadn't been random. They had been clearing the path for this. Her stance shifted, not back, not forward, but angled slightly to keep him in her periphery. The low sound in her chest rose again, but this time it wasn't the single note claim she'd made before. This was layered, rising and falling, the tones weaving into something that felt almost like words carried on heat. The big one stopped, just inside the emergency light's reach, its tendrils curling in tight, its head tilting slightly toward. It made a sound, an answer deep, slow, like stone, breaking underwater. He didn't understand the words, but the weight behind them made his stomach not nod. Her head turned slightly toward him then, eyes locking on his for the briefest heartbeat. It was the same look she'd given him in the cave, the one that had carried something unspoken, something that had lived decades without needing to be said. Then she stepped forward alone. The hub's air hung heavy, still, except for the faint hiss of coolant dripping into the shallow pools across the floor. Each droplet rippled outward, carrying the echoes of the two titans facing one another. She stood motionless, heat bleeding into the space in slow waves that made the mist shimmer. The larger creature mirrored her stillness, its segmented tendrils swaying faintly, tasting the air between them like invisible threads binding predator to predator. He stayed at the edge of the chamber, rifle aimed, but fingers loose on the trigger. This wasn't a fight he could start. It wasn't even his to interfere, and not yet. His pulse roared in his ears, but he forced his breathing steady, reading every line of her posture the way he once had in the cave. Back then, her stillness had been survival. Now, it was challenge. A low rumble started deep in her chest, rising in pitch until the floor beneath his boots began to vibrate. The sound was layered, almost harmonic, each note rolling into the next in a pattern that carried weight beyond instinct. He didn't know the language, but he could feel the precision. The way it rose and fell in deliberate intervals. The larger creature answered in kind. Its voice deeper, wetter, dragging through the air like heavy chains pulled across stone. The chamber seemed to contract with every exchange, the air temperature shifting in strange pulses heat when she spoke, cold when it answered, and then, without warning, fragments of understanding bled into his mind, not words, not sound, but impressions. The bigger one, hunter of the last fires, keeper of the brood, her, breaker of the brood's chain. The images that followed were jagged, like memories spliced into his vision, her species in flight under red skies. The larger creature among them like a shadow that blotted out the sun, the swarm pouring across valleys in a tide of teeth and claws. Then the cave, not from his memory, but hers him, dragging her from fire, feeding her water. His face locked into her mind like a brand. The bigger one's tendrils flared outward, each tip curling into a hook-like shape. Its head tilted further, the slow shift of its weight cracking the deck plating beneath its claws. She lowered her stance in answer, wings twitching as if struggling to contain their full span. The moment stretched, tense, balanced, a single breath away from shattering. Somewhere deep in the station, structural alarms began to howl. The hub's lighting stuttering like a heartbeat on the edge of stopping. When the light flared back for an instant, they both moved. They met with a sound that didn't belong in any human throat or machine raw, concussive, a collision of heat and force that made the entire hub shudder. Her wings snapped wide as she launched, claws carving lines of molten metal across the larger creature's chest. The bigger one absorbed the impact like a mountain taking wind, only to slam its forelimbs down. Claws punching through the deck and sending jagged fractures radiating outward. He stumbled with a shockwave, knees bending to absorb it, but his rifle never lowered. The air filled with the stink of scorched plating and something far fouler meat burning under her heat. The creature roared, jaws splitting into four as streams of viscous saliva sprayed across the floor, sizzling where it landed. She twisted under a swipe meant to take her head, tail snapping out like a steel whip and catching the thing across the jaw. The blow sent one of its jaw segments hanging loose, but it barely flinched. In the space between their movements, the deck below him buckled again, this time from smaller shapes spilling in through the breaches. The swarm had returned, pouring in around the edges of the fight. He opened fire, each bolt lighting the mist like lightning trapped in metal walls. Creatures shrieked and fell, but more surged over their bodies, claws scraping sparks from the deck. He kicked one back, putting 3 rounds through its center before it could recover, then pivoted to blast another off her flank. She didn't even glance at him, but her motion shifted, subtly turning in ways that left him clean lines of fire. The bigger one roared again, catching her by the wing joint and slamming her hard enough into the wall that the impact rippled through the plating. The sound that tore from her chest was pure fury. She raked upward with both foreclaws, splitting armor plates and digging deep enough that her heat poured directly into the wound. The stench of cooked tissue hit like a wall. He reloaded on instinct, pulse rifle snapping back to ready as he stepped into the chaos. One of the swarm leaped for his back. He dropped low, rolling to the side as it overshot and landed in her reach. Her jaws closed on it without hesitation, flinging the shredded body into the larger creature's face. The bigger one staggered for the first time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She slammed forward, pinning it to the bulkhead, her claws driving deep. The hub's structure groaned like it was about to give way under their combined weight, and then the lights failed entirely. The fight vanished into darkness, broken only by the gold-red glow of her eyes and another set of eyes opening in the black, higher, wider, burning cold. The blackness was total, swallowing the hub so completely that even the faint mist rising from the coolant pools vanished. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no sound, but the rasp of his own breath and the low, steady thrum of blood in his ears. Then the air shifted, thickened, and heat spilled across his left side like an open furnace door. Her dot, something huge, moved in front of her glow, blotting it out for half a second before a violent impact slammed through the floor. The deck tilted under their weight, groaning in protest. The bigger one's breath rolled across the space cold, fetid, carrying the stink of wet stone and rotting things. He crouched low, trying to track movement by sound. Claws screeched against metal. A deep growl rumbled from her chest. Then the sound of tearing, plating erupted as something massive was driven backward. A sudden flash lit the hub as his rifle spat bolts into the dark. The blue-white light catching a glimpse of slick black armor. Tendrils whipping through the air like spears. One tendril struck his rifle, ripping it from his hands. It clattered away into the dark. Another lashed toward his torso. He threw himself sideways, landing hard on his shoulder. The air knocked out of him. The world narrowed to the hiss of breath and the faint pulse of her glow somewhere ahead. A roar, her split. The dark. Heat surged outward in a shockwave, washing over him with enough force to make the mist burst into steam. Shapes screamed in response, the swarm surging forward. Claws scraped the deck all around, skittering closer. He grabbed the combat knife from his thigh plate, turning in time to jam it up through the skull of a creature that lunged from the side. The blade met almost no resistance, the body twitching as it slid off and collapsed. More came. Too many. Her glow flared brighter for an instant, a molten silhouette exploding into motion. He saw the arc of her wings, the downward slash of her claws carving into the bigger one's chest, sparks and blood raining together. The larger creature slammed her into the deck, the noise deafening, metal screaming under the force. Without thinking, he sprinted toward that sound, slipping on coolant, using the flashes of his knife and the heat of her body as guideposts. He reached them just as the bigger one reared back to bite down on her exposed neck. He hit the thing's flank, driving his knife deep between armor plates and yanking with all the strength he had left. The creature's bellow was a wall of sound, but it jerked sideways enough for her to twist free. She drove her jaws into the soft gap he'd opened, tearing until the scream cut short. The glow of her eyes was the last thing he saw before the deck gave way beneath him. The fall was a blur of weightlessness and noise. Steel beams and shattered plating screaming past as gravity pulled them into the station's underbelly. He hit hard, the impact punching the breath from his lungs and sending white fire through his ribs. The deck beneath him was slick with something warm that steamed in the faint glow above her blood. His blood, maybe both. She landed a heartbeat later. The impact shattering what remained of the floor panels and sinking her claws deep into the framework. For a moment she stayed crouched, head low, breath heaving invisible waves of heat. The glow in her eyes dimmed slightly, not from weakness, but from calculation. They were deeper now into the structural guts of the station, where gravity plating hummed irregularly, and the air was thicker with oil and machine dust. Overhead, the hole they'd fallen through was rimmed with jagged metal and shadows. Swarm shapes moved at the edges, but didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, distant clicks echoed down the twisted corridors, a slow rhythm that carried purpose. Whatever command the larger one had given before its death was still out there, pushing them forward. He staggered to his feet, retrieving his knife from where it had lodged in a fallen panel. His rifle was gone, lost to the black above. The heat she radiated kept the worst of the chill from settling in, but he could feel the gravity plates failing in pulses. Every few seconds, making his steps heavier or lighter. She turned her head toward him briefly, eyes narrowing, then moved down a slanted corridor with a gait that was part stock, part limp. The wound on her wing joint was still oozing molten dark blood, leaving faint trails that hissed where they touched the deck. He followed, knife in hand, every sense straining for movement in the dark. The deeper they went, the more the station changed. The architecture here was older than the rest of the outposts, sleek corridors, pipes as thick as tree trunks running overhead. Strange ridged panels in the walls, etched with markings he didn't recognize. The metal underfoot felt different, denser, warm in a way that didn't come from her heat. A faint vibration built under his boots. Separate from the failing gravity plating, rhythmic, slow, alive, she froze ahead of him, head lifting, nostrils flaring. Her tail twitched once before curling low, a subtle sign he recognized from the cave. Danger close and watching. Then, from the shadows ahead, two more sets of eyes, opens, smaller than hers, but bright, sharp, and hungry. The twin glows, hovered in the dark, unblinking, the color of molten coin, edges fresh from the forge. They blinked once, in perfect sync, and the sound that followed was a low, throaty rumble, not the threat of the swarm, but something wary, testing. The shapes moved forward, breaking from shadow into the spill of her heat. They were smaller, half her size at most, their scales a duller shade, as though the gold-red fire in them hadn't fully awakened. Their wings were folded tight, claws clicking lightly on the warped deck as they approached in halting, stuttered steps. The markings along their necks glimmered faintly, matching the pattern he'd seen under her scales in the cave long ago. His breath caught. Decades ago, the galaxy had called her kind extinct. He'd believed it, too, until he'd carried her broken and half-dead into the light. And yet here, in the hidden bones of a dying station, two more stood breathing, alive. She lowered herself slowly, wings dipping, neck arched so her head was level with theirs. A low sound thrummed from her chest, layered and rolling, different from the challenge she'd given the larger one above. This was softer, shaped like a question. The smaller dragons answered in kind, voices higher, carrying a resonance that brushed against his mind like warm static. Images trickled into him, not clear, but enough to form meaning. He saw the smaller ones huddled in darkness, the swarm moving through the corridors above like a tide of steel and flesh. He saw her, decades younger, carrying something fragile through smoke him while firestorm skies burned behind. And he saw this place, buried deep, the last cradle of their kind, hidden under layers of station metal to keep them safe from hunters. The pieces locked together with a cold clarity. She hadn't just come back for him. She had come back because of him, because once, against every reason, he had chosen to save something the galaxy had left for dead. That choice had bought her the decades she needed to find and protect these. Two, the younger ones, stepped closer, brushing their muzzles against her in quick, nervous touches. She closed her eyes briefly at the contact, then lifted her head toward the corridor behind them. The clicking from earlier returned closer now, multiplied. The swarm had found the cradle. The first of the swarm poured into the chamber like black oil spilling downhill, their segmented limbs scraping the deck, mandibles clicking in an obscene, eager rhythm. The glow of their multifaceted eyes reflected the dim gold of the dragon's scales, and the sight sent a flash of heat up his spine. She moved first. One wing snapped wide, sweeping the smaller dragons behind her bulk, while her other unfurled toward him like a barrier, an invitation at once. Her chest expanded, heat trembling in the air around her. And then she let it out in a razor-edged exhalation of white gold flame. The front ranks of the swarm dissolved into shrieks and curling smoke. He ran in beside her, rifle already whining as it built charge. The first burst tore through a knot of them, sending bodies tumbling over the slick deck. He didn't stop to think his boots slid on scorched metal. His shoulder braced against hers as though they'd trained for this. The air was thick with the taste of ozone and burned chitin, each breath scraping his lungs. The smaller dragons huddled together, their eyes wide, their necks weaving nervously, as if they were caught between terror and the instinct to leap into the fray. A stray crawler darted low toward them. He swung, blade flashing, and cut it down before it could touch them. It twitched once, then stilled. The swarm kept coming. For every one they dropped, 3 more scrambled over the bodies. Some clung to the walls, others darted along the ceiling like spiders, mandibles snapping. She leaped forward, her claws raking through armor and bone, her tail sweeping wide to smash another group into the far wall. The clang of impact rang through the chamber. Something massive shifted deeper in the darkness, echoing. Slow scrape, like a steel bulkhead being dragged across the floor. The smaller dragons flinched, pressing closer to her legs. He didn't even look toward the sound. His eyes stayed locked on the wave in front of them. She snarled, a deep sound that shook the metal beneath their feet. Her voice slipped inside. His mind again sharp, urgent this time. Not words, not images, just now. They weren't holding the line anymore. They were buying seconds. Behind them, the station's metal groaned in a way that told him the cradle's time was measured in heartbeats. The first shudder hit like a gut punch, rattling his teeth, making the floor dip underfoot as if the whole station had inhaled and didn't know how to exhale. Somewhere deep in the cradle's bowels, a structural brace snapped. He felt the vibration travel up through his boots before the sound reached him. A low, metallic groan that made the hairs on his arms rise. She felt it too. The great golden dragon twisted her neck, eyes locking with his for a fraction of a heartbeat before she lunged forward. The smaller ones didn't wait to be told. They clung to her sides, scrambled over her shoulders, pressed close to her bulk like children to their mother's skirt. He backed toward the corridor, firing in controlled bursts. The swarm surged after them, some leaping to bypass her and aim for him, others snapping at her wings. His rifle was hot enough to burn his gloves. The air in the corridor, thick with a stench of scorched alien flesh and acrid smoke from the overheated weapon coils. Another quake rippled through the deck, this one sharper, accompanied by the wet hiss of ruptured coolant pipes overhead. Cold vapor spilled down, mixing with the heat of her breath, creating an unnatural fog that curled around their ankles. The swarm moved faster inside it, shadows darting at the edges of his vision, too quick to track until they were close enough to feel. They reached a junction lit by a single flickering strip of pale light. The far bulkhead bore the scars of something clawing through, panels buckled outward. Beyond it was the faint shimmer of a force field holding back raw vacuum and through it the jagged stars. That was the way out. But the field was meant for cargo drones, not a dragon. He didn't even know if it could hold long enough for them to pass. The swarm behind them didn't care. She lowered her head, the muscles along her neck coiling, wings drawing tight against her body. Her mind brushed his again, this time with the image of open space, her wings spread wide. A burst of movement into the black. The station shuddered again, harder, and something gave way far below. The floor tilted. The swarm spilled forward, almost falling into them. His boots slipped, but her claw caught the decking, anchoring them both. The force field's hum changed pitch. It was degrading. They had seconds, maybe less. The deck was a killing floor, now metal, shrieking, gravity stuttering in uneven bursts. The air full of smoke and the metallic bite of venting atmosphere. The swarm came in waves, all claws and teeth and screeching hunger, spilling through the corridor like living floodwater. His rifle's coils were past red line. Each shot felt like trying to punch holes in a storm. She didn't wait for a signal. The golden dragon surged forward, wings tight, head low. Her claws tearing grooves into the deck as she drove toward the failing field. The younger ones clung to her in desperation, their tails coiled around her spines, claws hooked in scale gaps. He grabbed for her flank as she passed, boots skidding on the tilting floor. She caught him with a wing's edge, shoving him upward until his hand found purchase on a ridge of horn. The swarm tried to cut them off. They poured from vents and broken panels, their bodies spilling over the ceiling and walls in an insectal blur. One leaped for his back. He felt the scrape of its claws through his armor before a snap of her jaws crushed it into paste. The force field flickered, guttering like a candle in the wind. Beyond it, the void yawned ink-black space, stippled with cold stars. The massive planet below, a roiling ocean of cloud and lightning. A final tremor shook the cradle apart. A sound like ripping fabric filled the air as a fracture split the wall. Beside them, spilling debris and bodies into the vacuum, the force field's hum became a warbling scream. She launched. It wasn't a run or a jump hit, was an explosion of muscle and will. Her massive frame slamming into the failing field with a ripple of blue light. The barrier shattered in a flash. Fragments of shimmering energy spinning away like shards of glass. Air roared out, dragging him with it. The swarm, tumbling, passed in a writhing tide. His visor polarized against the sudden glare as the world turned into nothing but stars and speed. The cold hit like a hammer, the heat of the cradle gone in an instant. Her wings snapped wide, each beat a thunderous pulse he felt through his bones. The little ones held fast, their eyes wide and glowing against the void. Behind them, the cradle was tearing apart in silence. A slow-motion death as pieces spun off into the dark. He didn't look back for long. The swarm wasn't finished. They were following jagged shapes spilling from the broken cradle, propelled by thrusters or raw momentum. Their movements erratic but relentless, and they were gaining. Space became a battlefield without sound, only the pounding of his heart and the bone-deep vibrations of her wings cutting through the black. Her scales burned with reflected starlight, a beacon in the dark. The smaller dragons clinging to her with desperate faith. The swarms spilled after them like a shadow given life hundreds. Maybe thousands thrusters, flaring, claws extended. Their grotesque forms flickering in the cold light of distant suns. She twisted in the void, her body moving with a grace that mocked her size, whipping through impossible arcs that sent several swarm beasts colliding with each other in spinning, tumbling wrecks. He fired from her back short, controlled bursts that sent sparks of ruptured carapace spinning away. Each shot counted. Every miss meant another second closer to being torn apart. His HUD was screaming warnings, mirror gone, suit pressure fluctuating, oxygen ticking down in cold digital numbers. Then he saw it. Out beyond the chaos, past the tumbling wreckage of the Cridla, shape eclipsing the stars. At first, it seemed like a shadow of a forgotten moon, but then the lights flared across its surface, rippling gold and white. His mind almost refused to process what he was seeing. Dragons, not one, not a few, but an armada of them. Wings folded for flight in vacuum, eyes burning like comet cores. They came in silence, their bodies cutting through the void with a predator's precision. Each one carried strange armaments, shards of alien crystal glowing at the tips of their claws, coils of plasma wrapped along their wings. They weren't fleeing. They were hunting. The golden one gave a roar that was more vibration than sound in the emptiness. And the swarm hesitated just for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening needed. The sky lit up. Dragons moved through the swarm like lightning. Given form, their claws shearing through chitin, plasma flaring from their maws, crystal shards detonating in bursts of light so bright his visor auto-dimmed. The swarm's perfect unity fractured into chaos as they were torn apart, piece by piece. He felt the golden one banking hard, her breath flaring in the cold, her wings folding as she dove into the thickest part of the enemy mass. He held on as they spun, his rifle coughing the last of its charge before falling silent in his hands. And then it was over. The swarm was gone, nothing left but drifting husks and the cold glitter of alien ichor. The dragons circled, their bodies glowing faintly, the patterns in their scales shifting like living constellations. One of them drifted close, touching snout to the golden one, in a gesture both alien and unmistakably tender. For a moment, the galaxy was watching. Ships, stations, satellites, countless feeds across countless worlds caught the image. One human in battered armor on the back of a golden dragon, surrounded by a living fleet of creatures. Thought extinct. No war speech, no grand victory cry. Just a man, a dragon, and the truth no one could deny. Humanity had made an ally the stars themselves had forgotten, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy wasn't beyond saving.